Hello, and thank you for tuning in to MEMO's weekly review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and our regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, good to have you again.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Nasim. Thank you.
So, as usual, we'll be discussing key developments from Gaza and moving on to a really fascinating story from this week from the Jerusalem Post, shedding more light on the fact that the IDF knew about Hamas's attack on 7 October. We'll discuss that as well. And there seems to be a growing resignation within the Israeli military that they will not be able to defeat Hamas. And there's a rift between Netanyahu and his military staff. And we'll move on to a shocking scene we saw over the weekend of the Israeli military driving with a Palestinian man tied at front of a military vehicle. That's, of course, a clear example of how Israel uses human shields. We want to dive into the issue of Israel's use of human shields, not just in this conflict, but in the years gone before, in the past years as well. And there's an important story. It's actually gone unnoticed by a number of mainstream news agencies, which is the power transfer in the West Bank from the Israeli occupation forces to settler organization and settler groups, armed settler groups. Ramifications of that, I want to ask more about that as well. And of course, the escalation with Hezbollah. Are we on the verge of, well, are we, is Israel on the verge of a war with Hezbollah? And the general ineffectiveness of US, American, and British efforts to push back against the Houthis. And there are other topics I will ask Moin about. But let's begin with the latest developments, Moin, from Gaza. We are 9 months in. Israel has dropped something like 70,000 tons of bombs on the territory, surpassing, according to one statistic that has been compiled, the combined bombs that were dropped during the Second World War in London, Dresden, and Hamburg. And over the weekend, we saw Israel strike another refugee camp in Gaza and also bombed a section near the International Committee of the Red Cross, killing 22 Palestinians. So those were the most shocking details over the past few days. But give us your general thoughts on the latest developments in Gaza.
Yes, well, thank you. Well, this remains a war against the civilian population who have to bear the brunt of Israel's systematic revenge because Israel is unable to achieve a decisive victory over its military adversaries. Israel claims that it is now cleaning up or cleaning out the final 4 Hamas battalions who were allegedly situated in the southern town of Rafah. And almost as soon as the attack began, the Israelis began covering up for their failures with claims that actually most of the Hamas and other Palestinian militants had already left Rafah. Well, if that's the case, then the question that poses itself is, why are they relentlessly bombing not only Rafah, but civilian population centers in Rafah, including UNRWA, UN agency schools, encampments that are situated just outside the headquarters of the International Committee of the Red Cross, as you just noticed, noted rather, sorry, and killing dozens and dozens and dozens of civilians every 24 hours. It's these kinds of activities that have landed Israel before the International Court of Justice on the accusation of genocide. And it's why more and more states are joining South Africa in this case. Most recently this week, it has been Cuba. It's quite clearly a war against the Gaza Strip, against the civilian population of the Gaza Strip, against the civilian infrastructure of the Gaza Strip, where they've systematically destroyed the health and education infrastructure, the water infrastructure. They're bombing, they're killing medics, they're bombing aid convoys, as UNRWA just stated today. There is no safe place in the Gaza Strip. And the reason there is no safe place is because Israel has repeatedly directed the civilian population to certain areas, claiming they are safe zones, and then bombing them, bombing tent encampments and killing and burning to death dozens of civilians in the process.
Yes, and we should add the fact that the bombing on the refugee camp and the Red Cross is just one of a number of examples where Israel has attacked Palestinians, targeted Palestinians while they were seeking shelter in those refugee camps. And another story that it is surprised me, but I think it's a really important development, as far as I can see, because it's reported by the Jerusalem Post as well, which is the fact that the Israelis knew about the fact that Hamas was planning an attack and to kidnap at least 250 Israelis from southern Israel. And that's a story. I mean, there's a pattern that I see emerging. Right at the outset, many of the atrocities have been proven to be a hoax. For example, the 40 beheaded babies and the fact that rape was used as a weapon of war, that also has been discredited. But
Yes,
some of the
it
other,
wasn't a fact.
yeah, and some of the other stories which Israel pushed, dismissed as almost like conspiracy, is emerging to be more and more correct. And this is an example of that. Right at the outset, there was reports that Israel knew about this attack and it ignored it. And here we have this week the Jerusalem Post covering this story, providing more evidence that Israel definitely knew about this and decided not to do anything about it. How significant is this story, especially given it's covered by a pro-Israeli, news outlet?
Well, on this score, you're going to have to count me as a skeptic. Virtually from the moment the October 7th attacks took place, there have been a persistent series of reports that purport to show that Israel had information that, if it had been used properly, could have been used by Israel to prevent these attacks, or at least vastly reduce their impact. We've heard stories that the planning document, the master plan, was in the hands of Israeli intelligence. We've never seen it. I very much doubt that such a document ever existed. And this latest report, if you read the Jerusalem Post article, it actually talks about a military spotter who, a day or two before the October 7th attacks, witnessed a training exercise. And that training exercise later on turned to be pretty much exactly what those involved in this training exercise did in southern Israel. That doesn't strike me as confirmed proof that Israel had indisputable evidence of an attack that was about to take place and ignored it. I think we have to look at these stories in the broader context of Israelis seeking to evade responsibility for their failures on October 7th and seeking to pin it on others. So the politicians try to hold the military responsible. Military tries to shunt responsibility off to the intelligence services. The intelligence services say they were following orders from the government, and so on. Quite clearly, the Israelis had quite a bit of evidence at their disposal and failed to connect the dots. That seems to me clear. But the idea that this is somehow a repeat of the October 1973 war, where Israel received clear and explicit warnings that it was about to be attacked, had the information at its disposal, and chose to ignore it because of political complacency. That strikes me as vastly exaggerated. Sure, Israel had snippets of information, but I've yet to see conclusive evidence that Israel knew that an attack was about to be launched and chose to ignore that evidence on account of complacency and political preconceptions and disdain for its enemies and so on.
Let's move on to another theme which we've spoken about previously, which is the realization that Israel will not be able to defeat Hamas. There was an article this week, again in Foreign Affairs, by a really prominent analyst, Robert Pape. So he said Hamas is winning according to the measures that really matter. And his argument was that Israel, with its campaign, genocidal campaign in Gaza, is giving more incentives and motivation for Palestinians to join Hamas. Hamas is more popular now than it was before 7 October. So this is citing examples like that. And this is Robert Pape, who in 2005, I think, wrote a really interesting book called Dying to Win. And in that book, he argued, he examined why people carry out suicide attacks. And the bottom line the conclusion he came to after studying suicide attacks around the world is that nearly all the suicide attacks is really a resistance to occupation. Resistance to occupation is the primary cause of suicide attack, not religion, and not some messianic dreams, but generally just resistance to occupation. So he's that same author who now is saying that Israel has no way of defeating Hamas in Gaza. I just wanted to provide a bit of background to Robert Pape and the person who wrote the Foreign Affairs article, but there seems to be a wider recognition, not just in Israel, but in US academia and generally around the world, that Hamas is not going to be defeated by Israel.
Yes, and as you note, Robert Pape made his name by pointing out that the vast majority of suicide bombers that he studied during the first decade of this century were motivated less by ideological commitment than by conditions of occupation, and often personal trauma as well, for having lost family members, close friends, and so on through the actions of the occupation forces. And he's applying, I would argue, a broadly similar analytical framework here, and making the argument that Israel, by basically killing Palestinians on an industrial scale, is more or less ensuring that not only will Hamas be able to recruit many more fighters than it is losing in the current conflict, but also that ordinary Palestinians have absolutely no incentive to turn against this movement, and that looking at the available public opinion polls, its popularity is actually rising, because the only alternative that's being offered to them is this genocidal regime that would like to see them all disappear. So it's an interesting article, hardly the first, as you mentioned, but this one also by a highly respected authority on these matters, who is once again confirming that Israel is failing, Hamas is not losing, and that it is primarily Israel that is setting the conditions and creating the conditions for its own failure, and increasingly what some people are referring to as not only failure, but potential defeat.
And moving on to our next story, related to the Palestinian in the West Bank who was tied to a military vehicle. That was clearly an example of Israel using human shields. Francesca Albanese, who is the special rapporteur on Israel-Palestine, she described it as human shielding in action. And the image was really shocking. And I think for people who have studied this long enough know that Israel has been using Palestinians as human shields for many, many years. And I'd like to get your thoughts on that, and to really argue the fact that this is really not an isolated incident. And throughout the years, in previous conflicts, previous campaigns, Israel has used Palestinians as human shields.
Yes, I mean, I think it's important just to clarify what human shielding is, because we've heard this term used incessantly by Israel and its apologists since October 7th, basically saying that Hamas is using the population of the Gaza Strip as human shields. And when you examine that more closely, what they're basically saying is that Hamas is based in the Gaza Strip. Its members live in the Gaza Strip among the population of the Gaza Strip, and therefore they're using the entire population of the Gaza Strip as human shields, and therefore they can all be legitimately bombed to smithereens. Well, that's not how human shielding works. What human shielding refers to, it needs to have an element of coercion. In other words, individuals are coerced by an armed force into performing certain functions or placed in a certain physical location against their will, so that the armed force can derive a certain advantage from them. And among the Israeli military, this is a practice that goes back at least to the first Intifada during the late 1980s and early 1990s, where they would, for example, grab a school kid, tie him to the front of their Jeep, and then chase, for example, stone-throwing youths in the expectation that no one is going to throw stones at that Jeep because they don't want to hit, their classmate or their son or their brother or whatever. It then developed into something far more systematic, which was known among Israelis as a neighborhood procedure. Now, it might sound like, you're going to your neighbor and dropping off an apple pie or leftovers from dinner. But what the neighborhood procedure actually means in Israeli military parlance is that you grab a bystander, you have him march forward at the point of a gun, march in front of you, or enter a house, or open a package that is suspicious and so on, and you coerce that individual into basically performing military functions so that soldiers who are, heavily armed and so on are exposed to less risk. And this issue went to the Israeli Supreme Court, where the Israeli army launched a petition in the Supreme Court claiming it had a right and a need to continue to use individual Palestinians as human shields in the so-called neighborhood procedure. And so what we've seen now, these horrific pictures of not only a Palestinian civilian, but a wounded Palestinian civilian who had been shot by Israeli troops, tied to the front of the Jeep like some kind of deer caught on a hunt.
Reminded me of Mad Max. I don't know if you're familiar
Yes.
with that movie.
Yes, very, very well put. And then driving, towards their target in the hope and expectation that Palestinian militants or Palestinian youths would neither shoot at or throw stones. And I'm sure Israel and its apologists will have a ready-made excuse about how legitimate and wonderful all of this is and how it actually saves Palestinian lives. But again, if the shoe was on the other foot, I think they'd see the reality quite clearly.
Yes, and the way Israel has employed that term, human shield, it's really hollowed the term out of all meaning. The way it's being used in Gaza to justify its genocidal campaign, as though Hamas is just standing behind Palestinian civilians. So far, there's been no evidence of that, and I find it quite outrageous given the history of Israel using human shields to actually, like people say, every accusation is actually a confession. And this is what they're showing with this. The accusation against Hamas and the Palestinians is really a confession of really what they've been doing, the Israeli army has been doing for all these decades.
If I can just interject, I mean, this is a confession, if you will, caught live on video.
Yeah.
We have seen no evidence anything like this of these purported Palestinian Hamas or other Palestinian militant groups forcing Palestinian civilians to act as human shields. The closest we got, of course, was on October 7th, where there were a number of instances where Palestinian militants took civilians as hostages in various Israeli population centers. But within the Gaza Strip, the whole story about Al-Shifa Hospital and other places where Palestinians were supposedly used as human shields. Absolute bogus.
Sticking with the Israeli military, as an important development in the West Bank, the Israeli army has quietly handed over legal powers to the pro-settler organizations, which is under the supervision or the command of the Israeli far-right minister, Bezalel Smotrich. I want to get your thoughts on that story and how it relates to the International Court of Justice's case about the legality of Israel's occupation in the occupied West Bank. And I think the verdict is expected in next few months or so on that issue.
Yes. By way of background, many people may be under the impression that military occupation, because it sounds so distasteful, is illegal. In fact, military occupation is a recognized status under international law, and it is not in and of itself illegal. There are all kinds of policies and practices which, when undertaken in the context of military occupation, like genocide, that are illegal. But military rule in the context of an armed conflict, in and of itself, is not illegal. What the International Court of Justice case is about is that the UN General Assembly has sought an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice to determine whether Israeli rule in the occupied territories continues to qualify as a military occupation, or whether it no longer meets the criteria of a military occupation and is therefore illegal and illegitimate. And one of the most important criteria in this respect is temporality. In other words, a legal military occupation is by definition military and of a temporary nature. When it becomes permanent and civilian in character, it becomes illegitimate and illegal. And that's why Israel's establishment and expansion of dozens and later hundreds of civilian population centers, illegal settlements in occupied territories, is kind of exhibit A of the illegality of Israeli rule in the occupied territories. Now, this latest development concerns a speech given by Israel's finance minister, the far right, I think it's called National Religious Party or something like that. It's not the National Religious Party, but has a similar name. A speech he gave, which was supposedly secretly recorded, but I think he wanted it to get out, in which he is explaining that he is using his powers to transfer essential functions regarding the rule over the West Bank from the military to civilian agencies and civilian officials who are of a similar ideological ilk as him and Netanyahu. And this in and of itself strengthens very much the case that this is not a temporary military occupation, but is intended as a permanent civilian annexation. So in that sense, while Smotrich may be very proud of his achievement, from the perspective of the upcoming verdict in the International Court of Justice, it couldn't have come at a worse time for Israel.
And on that, I think when you listen to Western leaders, you realize how much in denial they are about this whole situation in the West Bank. In their mind, this is temporary, but Israel has never, well, especially the current crop of leaders, they've never said this is a temporary occupation as the Western supporters claim. This was always intended to be a permanent annexation. And that difference, I think a lot of people don't realize the fact that their version of Israel is completely alien to the version of Israel which the Israeli leaders foresee for themselves, which is that we will have permanent annexation of the West Bank and hopefully, in their eyes, permanent annexation of Gaza as well.
And now southern Lebanon.
And now, yes. So I think that, for me, shows the disconnect between how Western leaders see the occupation, illegal occupation, and how the Israelis see the occupation, which is that this is part of Greater Israel, and what the project is to create a Greater Israel. Moving on, I want to take a look at the region with a broader lens and see some of the other developments that's taking place with regards to Lebanon. Netanyahu came out recently saying that they are moving troops to northern Israel to confront Hezbollah. Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, he has flown to the US, and one of the issues they will be discussing is escalation with Hezbollah. And there seems to be, of course, there's been bombing of southern Israel and Israel bombing Lebanon throughout the conflict, but it's been escalating over the past few weeks. So it seems like there's a direct military confrontation between Israel and Hezbollah is now imminent. Is that how you see it as well?
May well be. I mean, the irony here is that Israeli military leaders are increasingly suggesting that they will not succeed in the Gaza Strip. Most recently, you had the Israeli military spokesman referring to Hamas as an ideology or an idea that can't be defeated after spending the last 8.5 months telling us every day that they were on the verge of ultimate victory. And as this recognition seeps in, if I understand correctly, these idiots are now trying to compensate for their failure in Gaza by taking on a much more powerful and well-organized and better armed adversary in Lebanon. I'm not a historian of the Second World War, but I can't imagine that in 1940-41, Hitler wasn't advised by senior advisors or senior generals not to invade the Soviet Union because it would be a completely irrational thing to do. But he ended up doing so anyway, which is another way of saying that if any rational person looks at the current realities of in the Middle East and the deficiencies of the Israeli military and its inability to take on a second order militia, its weakest adversary in the smallest territory, it would appear to be sheer madness to seek to take on Hezbollah, particularly because this could also precipitate a wider conflict with Syria, with Iran, perhaps with others. But just because it's rational doesn't mean it's going to happen. And I think the Israelis have given us repeated indications of their growing irrationality. And they're now, I think, seeking to get U.S. guarantees about certain forms of assistance that they would get. And here's where it gets interesting, because I suspect they have the leadership, Biden, Blinken, McGurk in their pocket, but you're hearing increasingly skeptical voices coming from the Pentagon, which is pointing out that Israel will have a much rougher time in Lebanon than it has had in Gaza if it decides to go in that direction. That this, in contrast to Gaza, a war against Lebanon, significantly increases the prospect of direct Iranian involvement. And last but by no means least, that it will be much more difficult for the United States to directly assist Israel against Hezbollah than it was able to directly assist Israel in warding off the Iranian retaliatory attack against Israel a few weeks ago.
And on the topic of escalation, I think we should also mention how utterly, how much of an utter failure the attempts to stop the Houthis from attacking ships on the Red Sea has been. So there was a report came out by responsible statecraft, which said that Britain and the US, they've launched a number of airstrikes on Hodeidah Airport and various other seaports, but these were completely unsuccessful. And despite trying hard. They've failed to deter the armed Houthis from attacking ships on the Red Sea. And we should mention they're only attacking ships that are in some way affiliated with the US or Israel. So the question is, I mean, why have they been so effective? And where does Israel get the confidence that it can just move on to Hezbollah and strike Hezbollah down and then undermine what they call the Iranian proxies in the region? Of course, we can question that. Houthis are not, they will say, we're just Iranian proxies. They are Yemenis who are fighting for their interest. And that's a completely different way of looking at it. So why have they been so ineffective in this case?
Yes, I mean, Israel, which likes to present itself as the guardian of Western interests in the Middle East, now needs to be directly protected by the West. It's not Israel that's seeking to keep the Red Sea open for Israeli shipping. It's, as you noted, the US and the UK that have had to send a task force there called Operation Prosperity Guardian. So it's the West that has had to intervene directly and expend considerable resources to defend the interests of its proxy, rather than the proxy doing what a proxy is supposed to do, which is to promote the interests of its sponsor. As far as the Yemenis and Ansar Allah or Houthi movement is concerned, I mean, let's recall, Yemen was under constant daily bombardment by the Saudis, by the Emiratis, by other members of that coalition. And people may be dismissive of the Saudi or Emirati Air Force. Well, A, they're quite sophisticated. B, they have many of the most advanced weapons available from the US arsenal. And C, if that isn't enough, well, they were also assisted by targeting assistance by the United States and the United Kingdom and others. And this went on for years, from 2015 till, I believe, around 2021 or 2022, and it never broke the Houthis. To the contrary, one can argue they emerged stronger from this conflict than they were at the beginning. And it seems that we're witnessing something similar now. Several months of conflict now with the US and the UK. I should add the bombings by the Americans and the British on Yemen have been vastly less intense than those during the war of the past decade. And they haven't achieved much. And most importantly, they have failed to break the Houthis' resolve. They have failed to undermine the ability, the operational capacities of the Houthis. And we also need to bear in mind, the Houthis are not in this to sink ships. They don't need to do that. What they need to do is create conditions where these major shipping companies that control a very sizable proportion of the international commercial shipping market decide it's too risky to go through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, or no longer want to pay the astronomical insurance fees that they would now have to pay as a result of this conflict, and decide to take the alternate route around the Cape of Good Hope and the coast of West Africa instead. So the Houthis, in a sense, achieved their objectives simply by making threats. It's very unlike a conventional war where they actually have to hit their targets and sink ships in order to achieve their objectives, although they have, of course, hit a few ships recently.
And to add to that, there was a video that came out and was shared on social media and went viral, actually, of Yemenis mocking the American efforts to undermine Houthi attempts to push back against the Israelis. And the video basically says that another example of how war has become, how conflict, the commodification of war and conflict. The Houthis with weapons which cost some few thousand quid can now target Israeli and American weapons, which cost hundreds of thousands of pounds, which again shows that the balance has become more equalized now. You can take on the Americans, who have arsenal worth millions of pounds, with missiles and weapons which are made at the back of a house. So that really works in favor of organized groups like the Houthis and Hamas as well. And it's really a broader trend where we have seen the commodification of war, meaning that wars become very simple to conduct if you have the means and the wit to be able to do that. And that's a major threat to superpowers like the US and regional superpowers like Israel.
Yes, I mean, compare this to the 1970s and 1980s when you had the PLO in southern Lebanon, and their range was basically limited by the range of a Katyusha rocket. So unless you were living in the northern Israeli border zone, you could completely ignore this conflict and live your life as you please. Now, past years, we've had Hamas, which with arguably more rudimentary capacities, has been able to manufacture rockets that can hit Tel Aviv, Haifa, Jerusalem. Well, imagine what Hezbollah is capable of. But again, just to get back to the point, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Ansarullah in Yemen, these things are all connected, and it's quite clear that these subsidiary conflicts, if you will, what the Hezbollah and the Houthis and others refer to as solidarity fronts, will continue and arguably will continue to escalate unless and until there is a permanent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip and an end to the genocidal onslaught by Israel with the support of the US and the West on the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. And quite clearly, what Washington and London and Brussels have decided is that they would rather see a further escalation of regional conflict than an end to this genocide, and with it an end to these subsidiary fronts.
Let's turn our attention to an issue which has been ongoing for many years, which is the BDS campaign. And for me, this is a further evidence that the global conditions are looking very bad for Israel. I don't just mean militarily. There was a report that came out last week by an organization called the Edelman's Trust Barometer. They surveyed 15,000 people across the region, Middle East and elsewhere, and they found that over a third of the populations in countries like UAE, Saudi Arabia, UK, US, India, they were all boycotting companies and firms that are perceived to be supporting Israel. So I remember, just not long ago, people were mocking the idea of BDS, saying, "Oh, BDS is not effective," but really, BDS is catching on. More and more people are now choosing to boycott Israeli goods, or any company that are seen to be supporting Israel in some shape or form. And we saw last week Barclays Bank pulling its sponsorship in the UK from a music festival, because of its support for Israel. So even major institutions are now having to think, okay, is this going to harm our reputation? I was in Qatar a few months back. Every Qatari I spoke to, they all boycott any company like McDonald's or Coke that appears to be supporting Israel. So you cannot simply say BDS is not working and BDS is just a futile attempt to apply pressure on Israel. That doesn't seem to be the case. And this report is further confirmation of that. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I would argue that if you take into consideration that many people who were surveyed live in states where it's quite risky to express solidarity with the Palestinians or criticism of Israel, that the numbers may actually be significantly higher than they were. I would make several points. First of all, I do continue to believe that these kinds of individual boycotts are, on the one hand, important, but at the same time tend to be largely symbolic. I think they begin to have a significant impact when one of two things happens. When either major corporations start taking such popular sentiments into account when they make investment decisions. And I think there is evidence that we're beginning to see some of that. But even more importantly, when it filters through to government policy. So, for example, that certain countries will stop trading with Israel, will stop exporting, or will stop importing. That's where I think you will see a much bigger impact than these kinds of individual or community initiatives, which again I consider important, but of a primarily symbolic nature. I think what we've seen in recent years is that, interestingly enough, corporations which exist more or less for the sole purpose of making profit are more responsive to public pressure than governments and political parties, which rely on the consent of the voters. In other words, campaigns for corporate social responsibility appear to be having often a greater impact than efforts to influence government policy, where we're seeing this growing disconnect between ruler and ruled. I mean, if you look at public opinion polls in the United States and in Europe, on the one hand, you have clear majorities either against Israeli apartheid or for a Gaza ceasefire, whatever. And then, governments acting as if they're members of the Israeli parliament or Israeli governing coalition.
I think on that, I should, for our viewers, use this opportunity to say, buy a new book by Ilan Pappé called Lobbying for Israel on Both Sides of the Atlantic. And he basically answers that question, how throughout, I would say, centuries, Israel has been, well, before Israel, Zionist groups have been lobbying on behalf of Israel or for the creation of a Jewish state in historic Palestine. And in their lobbying, they basically focused on centers of power, whether it be state or major influential firms and companies, but they ignored the masses, and that space was basically left unattended. And now you're seeing the result of that, where the governments and major corporations are allied with Israel, whereas the global masses and the population are opposed to Israel. And you see that conflict now being borne out by the fact that they ignored that space, and now they're having to catch up and ban TikTok, for example, or take measures to crack down on grassroots support for the Palestinian cause. And that really is a consequence of the fact that Israel and the lobby organization supporting Israel has 100% laser focused on states, governments, and major global institutions. And if you want a deeper answer to that, I recommend buy that book. It's a long book, but it's worth reading. Let's end on the issue of boycott. Let's end with that question, which is one of the most, I would say, influential lobbying organization in the US, sorry, the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, as it's known. It was labeled last week by Wikipedia, the online, the online platform, as a propaganda and source of propaganda and misinformation. So this is the same Zionist group, the ADL, that has been lobbying for the adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, a definition that conflates criticism of Israel with anti-Jewish racism. And the way I look at these organizations, I see them as quite nefarious in the same way as, for example, the weapons industry is nefarious. The weapons military industrial complex inflates threat. It's in the interest to do that. And the ADL is in its interest to inflate the threat of anti-Semitism across the world. And I don't see them as being a force for good. and ADL has now been labeled, let's just say, by Wikipedia as being a source of misinformation, source of propaganda, despite that it's been permitted to push through in Congress a definition of anti-Semitism, which conflates criticism of Israel or Zionism as being anti-Semitic. That's a huge victory, don't you think, Mouin?
Well, it helps explain why so much on Wikipedia, the online encyclopedia, is wrong. It's not the ADL, it's the DL. It's not the Anti-Defamation League, it is the Defamation League. It is an organization that specializes in defamation. Its main activity is defamation. It doesn't combat defamation. It promotes defamation. It engages in defamation. Its bread and butter is defamation. It conducts defamation around the clock, 24/7, 365 days a year. That's the organization we're talking about. And it's simply Orwellian to refer to it as the Anti-Defamation League rather than as the Defamation League. This is an organization that is not only an agent of the Israeli government, but during the 1980s actually conducted espionage in the United States on behalf of the white minority regime in apartheid South Africa. Anti-defamation, my ass. I'm sorry, but that's the only way to express it.
Yeah, I fully agree with you there, and I'm just glad it's been found out, but I don't think it will stop, of course, many of the APEC-funded members of Congress from seeing it for what it really is, which is really an agent of the Israelis to push a narrative and cultivate an atmosphere which inflates a threat to Jews. If anything, Israel's policies is what's been inflating threats to the Jewish community in the UK and elsewhere, and of course the US. So I think that this organization needs to be labeled, as Wikipedia has done, as a propaganda and misinformation source. Right. Thanks, Mon. I mean, that wraps up our conversation for this week. So that was my guest, Mouin Rabbani. And I want to thank you also for tuning in, and see you next week for another review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and our regular guest, Mouin Rabbani.
Thank you.